Now, how was the Quran preserved at the time of revelation? You know, because people may be anxious to ask or have questions or doubts. Well, okay, it's the same book from 1400, 1500 years ago, but how do we know that at the time of revelation it was kept solid, it was kept uniform?
The Arabian civilization is well known for its poetry and its oratory skills. So basically they depended to a great extent on memorization and repetition. So when the ayat were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he used to have around him some of his companions, including some scribes who had the task of writing down these ayat that were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And these were written on pieces of skin, bones, the leaves of palm trees, things like that. And these were collected during the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, just as a written document. However, the major part was in the hearts and in the minds of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And there's a very great scrutiny that was taken to collect all of these parts of the Quran into one document. So we could not, those who collected the Quran at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and afterwards, did not rely on the words of one person. They had to have several people confirming the exact same words, the exact same sequence, the exact same pronunciation for it to be documented.
Now, the Quran was, like you said, was revealed in a time where the Arabs, who were very poetic, had a lot of linguistic skills. How do we know that the Quran basically was not a product of that?
And that's a very interesting question, because we believe as Muslims that each prophet or messenger was sent with a miracle coming from the same skill of his people. So for example, at the time of the Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, magic and sorcery was something big. And his miracle was to defeat all of these magicians of the Pharaoh. At the time of Jesus, peace be upon him, healing and medicine was a big thing. And some of the miracles of Jesus, peace be upon him, were in the same line, curing the leper, restoring the eyesight for the blind, and the ultimate miracle, reviving the dead with the will of God. At the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, since his people were poets and were very eloquent and so on, the miracle had to be from the same source. So the Quran defied, God the Almighty defied the non-believers at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to come up with something similar to the Quran. The challenge initially was, come up with 10 surah. And then the challenge was upped, come up with 1 surah. And then the challenge was upped again, come up just with 1 ayah, come up with 1 line similar to the eloquence of the Quran. And they could not. And that's why many of them knew deep inside that these are not the words of a human being. Because if they were, we could come up with similar words, but they couldn't.
And is that why Islam grew so rapidly at that time?
Indeed, because people knew that these are not the words of a man. It's talking about things that they have never experienced before, so that it has to have come from a different source.
So no one at that time or since has been able to duplicate the Quran or even come to anything close to it?
They tried unsuccessfully.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about some of the miracles of the Quran. You mentioned briefly some linguistic, scientific, some things that we are just discovering about the universe. Can you mention some examples of this?
Well, there are so many miracles in the Quran. One great scholar have counted about 1,300 miracles in the Quran, 1,300 physical miracles in the Quran. And they would vary from one person to another about their perception. I'm going to tell you a personal story. I was driving a couple of years ago from Greenville to Raleigh, and I usually listen to NPR on my way, not to fall asleep. And they had a guest on that program. I think it was Science Friday, which comes on Fridays. He was the chief scientist in Dana-Farber Cancer Research Institute in Boston, which is one of the highest cancer research institutes. And he was talking about, one of the people asked him on the phone, is there any correlation between breast cancer and breastfeeding? And he mentioned that, well, it has been proven beyond any doubt that a woman, a mother, who nurses her child for the full term of nursing, which is 2 years, reduces considerably the chances of getting breast cancer. And I was driving, in fact, at that time. I couldn't help but lift my hands and shout loudly, God is great. Because you're going to find in the Quran, 1400 years ago, an ayah that says, mothers, and you can find it literally in the Quran in chapter number 2 or surah number 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, mothers should nurse their babies for 2 full years for whoever wants to accomplish the period of nursing. So who could have known about that? This is something very interesting. And by the way, this is an ayah that I have read several times before.
Many times
and
never really thought about it.
I kept asking, why is this detail in the Quran? And as if God the Almighty is telling me, here's the reason why this detail is in the Quran. Another example, for example, whenever we are on a plane, one of the first safety instructions is if the pressure drops in the plane, the masks are going to fall down and so on. So we know that whenever we go up in the air pressure is reduced and you cannot breathe. It's almost impossible to breathe on your own in this condition. God the Almighty mentioned that in the Quran, believe it or not, about those who show disbelief in the words of God as if they're going up in the air and their chest being so tight and they cannot breathe. Now, at that time there were no airplanes. No one has ever experienced that at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually until the beginning of the 20th century.
Sure.
So how did anyone know about that if it were not a revelation from the Almighty? And there are so many other examples. There's not enough time to discuss all of them.
Now, does science and the Quran contradict each other?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because again, the exact science comes from the Almighty. And the Quran comes from the Almighty, so it cannot contradict each other. They cannot contradict each other.
Now, there are very specific verses in the Quran describing embryos,
Yes.
Describing the universe,
Yes.
how the universe is expanding. All this stuff you believe are miracles of the Quran?
Absolutely, because these are things that we are discovering nowadays. For example, when you read in Surah Al-Mu'minun, the ayat about the creation of the human being, what are the different phases of the creation in the womb until the birth of that baby, that newborn, it's a miracle because no one knew exactly what was that sequence. And these are mentioned in so much detail in the Quran.
Now, if these are things that we are just learning about in the last decade, the last century, how did Muslims of that era, when the Quran was revealed, how did Muslims take that information? How did they understand or comprehend that information?
That's a very good question, because many of these miracles can be understood in different ways. And the Quran addresses different mentalities, addresses different environments. So for the fishermen, there are ayat that can be understood to address the fishermen or the sailors, for example. For the people living in the desert or the shepherds, there are ayat that are meant to, or that can be understood as relating to the shepherds and so on. So it's not just addressed to one profession or one group of people. It's a universal message. I'll give you a brief example. This is again something that I personally experienced probably more than 20 years ago, about 25 years ago. There was a group of German Muslims who have recently embraced Islam, who were on a visit to Egypt, and I saw one of them who was a big and tall person who I later on learned that he was a sailor. And I asked him, what brought you to Islam? How did you become a Muslim? He said, well, I was on a ship in the North Sea during a storm at night, on a moonless night, and it was cloudy and the sea was very stormy. And on the ship there was a person. I didn't know at the time he was a Muslim, but he was reciting something in a different language. So I asked him, what are you doing? What are you reciting? And he said he was reciting Quran. And I asked him, can you tell me what are you reciting? He said, well, the passage that I'm reciting is talking about something similar to where we're in right now, a storm with waves on top of each other, clouds on top of each other, different layers of darkness. So when I put my hand in front of me, I cannot see it out of the darkness. And the man said, well, I have been through that before, and in fact I have stretched my arm to look at my hand and I couldn't see it. who is the sailor who wrote these words? So the man answered, well, he was not a sailor. In fact, it was not written by a human. It was revealed to a man who has never been at sea, who lived all his life inland in the desert. So he said, so how come he knew about these things? When was that written? And he said, 1400 years ago. So the man started inquiring about the Quran, and later on, God the Almighty guided him to Islam.